Messellech, I was noticing that the Annie Casey Kids Count report just came out, and I was looking at the states, and I have to say I'm a little embarrassed.
Well, that's what happens when you're from Texas and I'm from Connecticut.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I was looking at the rankings, and Connecticut's number 8. The great state of Texas is ranked pretty pathetic 43rd.
It's funny because, when you're in a blue state, red state, purple state, sometimes it's hard to understand what that means in day-to-day life, and especially in our world, in child advocacy, what that translates to child well-being. And I think what, the kids count data shows is these decisions and policy matters as it relates to kids. And there's especially in the work we do working on the cross, there's an impact.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that what's is exciting today about today's podcast too is we have one of the most premier, awesome advocates in the country for children, Dr. Terry Brooks, and he's from Kentucky. It's a tough state. He's got a very difficult road to hoe there to try to get positive things for kids. And he's managed to have some successes. He plays a lot of defense, which is a very different and contrasting thing to what other advocates in some other states have, where they may have just a very positive political environment for kids. And so they're just always on the offense. But Terry's got to play both sides of that, but often it's a lot of defense.
Yeah, it's a lot of compromise and it's a lot of shifting narratives depending on who you're talking to. And I think Terry does that beautifully and with a lot of grace.
From First Focus on Children, this is Speaking of Kids. I'm Bruce Lesley.
And I'm Messellech Looby. Speaking of Kids is a podcast that puts kids at the center of public policy.
As we were thinking about this episode, really made me think back to our conversation with Annie Andrews and Renee Harvey in episode 8, where they were really talking about, an important thing for child advocacy is to really get more child-centered, child-friendly elected officials. And so she's working on, a political action committee to change the elections to elect more child-friendly people. So that's one approach. And I think today what we're going to hear from Terry is he's got to just deal with what he's got and make the best of it, which I think he has done an amazing job of in Kentucky. But it's just very different.
Yeah, I think the solution to a lot of the issues that we work on have to be layered, right? Like the approach has to be layered. And so the work Annie's doing in building up the PAC with her team is so important because that's the long-term goal and view. But you and I both know that it takes a long time, to really implement that change, to get elected officials in that really understand the issues, especially our issues. And then you're dealing with, the reality of just day in and day out. And you still have to make these advances and advocate for children in a red state where Terry is. And that's just his reality, so it forces him to build relationships, right? Especially when you're part of an organization. There's a lot of overlap in the way that Terry and First Focus, we both approach our work, right? It's like we work on the cross of issues. And so you're dealing with elected officials that may be great on one issue, but terrible on another. And so if you have that relationship, it's easier to shed light, to move the needle on some of the issues that otherwise typically won't budge through an organic relationship.
And I feel like Annie really is focused on sort of electoral gains for kids, whereas Terry's really focused on, the day in and day out legislative, what can I get accomplished and what do I have to defend against? And so he's got the here and now, and he can't give up on anyone, whereas Annie's picking sides. But it's not to say one side's right or wrong. Like, they're both right. We need both things. We need more and more policymakers who are good on kids' issues, and all the work that Annie and her team are doing is just critical. And then it's also, the leadership that Terry provides for the whole child advocacy community. He doesn't give up on anyone. He's making the case for kids to Democrats, Republicans, Independents, whoever walks across his front door, he's advocating and pushing them to really think about kids.
Yeah. And again, First Focus, we're oftentimes in that boat as well. depending again on the issue, depending on what's moving, you have a dream, to eventually have more elected officials that understand the nuances and the needs of children and families. But that dream doesn't always equate to your reality that you're living every day. And on top of that, these relationships and to build them require time, and time requires money, right? And money requires funding. And so there's a layered effect of how the child advocacy landscape as a whole has shifted. And I think, you've talked about this over the years. I mean, you've been in this space now, Bruce, going on 25 years, 25,
Yeah,
I mean, more or less,
Yeah.
So you've seen the full range. I mean, how do you feel like, again, at the broadest level, child advocacy is doing today?
It's frustrating, I have to say. I feel like as a community, we may be at one of our lowest points. We've just been seeing a lot of our colleagues and peers in our space who are great advocates for kids, like really great organizations, just either disappear or just lose so much funding that their capacity is limited. And that goes for us too. I mean, we've lost funding in the past few years. And so while we see the other side, this sort of anti-child movement gaining power to some extent and getting more and more resources. And I just feel like at this time, we're really struggling as a community, and really then leads me to really want to hear from Terry, because he's really dealing with a very tough situation in his state and managing to do some really great work at the same time.
Yeah, I'm excited for our listeners to get a taste of what Terry has to say. Terry Brooks served for more than 3 decades as a public school administrator in Kentucky. Dr. Brooks was also lead qualitative researcher for the Governor's Center of Excellence for the Advancement of Teaching, as well as an adjunct professor at institutions such as Harvard and Vanderbilt universities.
In 2005, Dr. Brooks took over the reins at Kentucky Youth Advocates, the seminal nonprofit watchdog for Kentucky's kids. KYA carries a multi-policy portfolio leading work in economic well-being, health, child welfare, education, early childhood, and juvenile justice. Under Dr. Brooks' leadership, KYA is one of the leading child advocacy groups in the country. Terry, welcome.
Welcome.
Hey, Bruce, thanks. The respect we have for First Focus here at Kentucky Youth Advocates.
Oh, and likewise, we're so happy to have you, and we've learned so much from you over the years, and just a fantastic partnership we have.
Absolutely.
With you all. Yeah. Well, before we get into politics and child advocacy, I know you're a huge Louisville Cardinals fan.
Amen.
And as a basketball fanatic myself, I wanted to ask you a very important question of how is Louisville going to get back to its past prominence in college basketball? What is it going to take?
Yeah, I think the key is we actually now have a coach who can coach. So we feel really good. Coach Kelsey came to us this past year after we fired the worst basketball coach in the history of the world. And so we've done a good job, I think, with restocking folks, and we're ready to roll, baby.
That's awesome. Well, now that we solved that problem.
That's it. That's it, isn't it?
Absolutely. We always ask people sort of like their foundational questions. And so why did you choose this career? Why did you become the executive director of Kentucky Youth Advocates? And, what got you involved in trying to improve the lives of Kentucky's kids, but also our nation's kids? You guys do such great work at both the state and national levels. So what brought you to this field?
Well, I wish I could give you some articulated roadmap, but the real story, I had spent over a quarter of a century as a public school administrator. In Kentucky, we have an unusual situation where if you have 25 years or more of experience or you are age 55, and in my case, I check both of those boxes, you literally lose money working. You make more in retirement than you do working. And while I loved being in a school, it's way too rigorous for a hobby. And so I actually had accepted a position to start the PhD program at a local private university, was all ready to roll, and KYA became open. The chair of the board at the time, that's now 20 years ago, I had known from a previous life, and she was like, hey, we just need a 2-year commitment to do some organizational turnaround work. Well, I was familiar with KYA in terms of their advocacy, and that seemed like a kind of an interesting transition from the K-12 world to higher ed. And so since come January, it'll be 20 years, I guess I'm in the longest interim transitional effort in history. I will say that from a deep perspective, I really learned pretty quickly that it was the call of my life. I thought that education was my career. It was actually just a prelude for what I'm doing now. I can't tell you it was intentional, was more accidental, but it was a wonderful accident.
Yeah. For our listeners who may not be familiar with Kentucky Youth Advocates, tell us a little bit about the comprehensive work you guys do for kids.
Sure. Well, Kentucky Youth Advocates is a nonpartisan nonprofit. We see ourselves very much as Kentucky's kids' lobbyists, both in the state capitol in Frankfort and in Washington. Within the scope of Kentucky, we're somewhat unique in that I, at least, am not smart enough to figure out how kids grow up in silos. And so I think that economic well-being affects education achievement and health outcomes. And I think economic security affects family stability. So we tend to look at kids and policies in an interdisciplinary, inter-arena way. There are some wonderful nonprofits in Kentucky that work on behalf of kids. They tend to be fairly singularly focused. So we do health, but we don't do education. We do juvenile justice, but we don't do child welfare. We certainly partner with them, but I think what does perhaps distinguish us is that interdisciplinary approach. We also act as somewhat of an umbrella for a variety of coalitions throughout Kentucky. An example is that depending on the day of the week, Kentucky either has the most or the second most kids living in kinship care in the nation, usually over 100,000 kids. Several years ago, we figured out that kinship caregivers did not have a support system. And so we organized the Kentucky Kinship Coalition, where we bring together caregivers from throughout Kentucky and work with them thinking about resources, policy needs, et cetera. We also do some focused work around youth engagement. An example is that we have a burgeoning group of young people who are foster care alumni. That's called True Up. And it's fascinating because those young people, for instance, recently conducted a really comprehensive qualitative look at the state's foster care system, were brought to Frankfort to testify, met with folks in the cabinet. And so we try to bring voice, whether it's young people or kinship providers, to our policy work. So hopefully those voices from the ground, a strong regiment of data and research, and a focus on an interdisciplinary policy agenda are kind of the qualities. We also strive to have an equal number of Republicans and Democrats hacked off at us on any single day of the week. So those are the 3 or 4 things that when I think about KYA, it's what I hope folks think of.
That's great. You have such a unique perspective, both from, the 20 years that you've been at KYA, but then even before that as an educator working in K through 12 public education. What are some of the major issues and challenges facing children in Kentucky and then also nationwide at the moment? And to add to that, have you seen a shift in these issues over the last, 3 or 4 decades that you've been involved with children?
Sure. That's a great question. And I think, Bruce, you said you wanted to limit this to a 4-hour podcast, so this will only take an hour and a half. I would suggest 3 or 4 issues, policy arenas that come to mind. There are 3 or 4 arenas that I would highlight for different reasons. The first is around childhood poverty. Bruce, it's not an accident that, Time Magazine featured you on that topic. And so I know that your heart is right there. My take on why that is an issue in Kentucky and nationally is I really feel like people have accepted childhood poverty kind of like gravity. It's just going to be there. So, when Kids Count is released, we always talk about the level of childhood poverty as kind of that canary in the coal mine that is going to tell us where the other areas will go. And we'll say things like, if today is a typical day in Kentucky, over 200,000 kids woke up in poverty. I just don't hear folks being upset about that. And I feel like it's lost a lot of fervency in the national conversation. So my takeaway on that is that we as advocates are going to have to get much better at finding a message to reinvigorate commitment around that arena. The one that drives me just crazy is juvenile justice. Drives me crazy in Kentucky for one reason and nationally for another. And that is that at least when I look at what is happening nationally, we have an odd bifurcation of legislation, which is a group of states are passing really important progressive legislation. And we have a group of states that are passing a frightening battery of regressive legislation. Digging in a little bit further, what we see is that those two sets, the good news for kids group and the bad news for kids group, have no rhyme or reason. It's not red states versus blue states, southern states versus western states, states with a Democratic supermajority or a Republican. And I'm frankly still sorting through that, but there's something in the water. There's something in the water that is galvanizing folks around juvenile justice. In Kentucky, 10 years ago, we passed what was really regarded as a national model for juvenile justice. It's working really effectively. So the General Assembly has decided to reverse course and let's start getting regressive. Let's start locking kids up for truancy again. Let's start trying to treat kids more like adults again. So the second policy arena that I guess I would suggest we all need to be paying attention to is that odd bifurcation when it comes to juvenile justice. The third, which will not surprise you, is K-12. That is a mess, seemingly, in every state, including Kentucky. When we look back at Kentucky, the irony is that this is the 35th year for Kids Count. So 1990 was the first year. And 1990 was the year that, media critics said that new show Seinfeld would not make it through the season. The largest McDonald's in the world opened in Moscow. And the weirdest thing of all was the national model for education reform was Kentucky. 35 years later, 2 out of 3 kids in the 4th grade don't meet minimal proficiency standards in reading. 8 out of 10 kids don't meet minimal proficiency standards in math. And all the General Assembly wants to talk about are hot button social issues. What they don't want to talk about is reading, writing, and arithmetic. So I'm very, very, very despondent and discouraged on K-12 because it's been seized by partisan political factions on the left and on the right. The fourth issue that I would just invite folks to keep their eye on, and so this is a prediction. I got inside info, I think, on it. I think regardless of the presidential election results, you're going to see at least the Senate, and I assume the House, re-tackle some big swings at child welfare come January. So what I hope happens is that folks like First Focus, some national conveners, can help advocates get their act together so that we can share a minimal, focused, and consensual agenda. So when that action starts to happen, we can help lead it rather than simply react to it. So poverty, juvenile justice, K-12, and child welfare are at least 4 areas for very different reasons that I think should be on the front of folks' brains.
Coming up after the break, Terry pulls the curtain back on how legislation gets cooked up in different states of the union that are mysteriously similar, or who might be behind it all.
Now, what our legislators tell us is they thunk it up on their own. The fact that identical legislation was filed in 24 states last year, you have to either believe in spontaneous legislative combustion. So you believe that legislators in Mississippi, Missouri, Michigan, Montana, and Kentucky all came up with the same idea at the same time, my goodness, or you think their strings are getting pulled.
Stick with us.
Making the world a better place for all children can seem like an impossibly huge task. Some of you may be thinking, I am just one person. What could I possibly do to make a difference? I'm Lesley Nimatala, Vice President of Advocacy and Mobilization at First Focus on Children. And I'm inviting you to join us and become one of our volunteer advocates, whom we call our ambassadors for children. Ambassadors are our most active child advocates who raise critical issues with the U.S. Congress and with the administration related to child policy and funding decisions, both for kids in the U.S. and worldwide. But don't take my word for it. We asked one of our ambassadors to share her experience.
Hello, my name is Annette Bridges, also known as Dr. B, and I live in Louisville, Kentucky. The welfare of children and their families is a deep concern for me and really always has been, especially those from marginalized communities. I care about equity in education, resources, and health. And I'm not quite sure what it's going to take for our elected officials to invest in our children, and I mean fully invest in our children. It really boils down to the haves and have-nots. It's a selfish attitude if an elected official does not consider children as a priority. I say selfish because, if you think about it, other countries with less resources can provide universal preschool as an option for families. Then why is it that our country can't do that as well? I am proud to be an ambassador for First Focus on Children because they are serious about the work they have done, are doing, and will do in the near future. Their efforts are relentless. Think about being an ambassador for them, being a voice for the voiceless. I can't think of anything else more worthy. Thanks for listening, and it's been my pleasure to talk about what is near and dear to my heart, and that is children. Thank you for your time.
So please join us, won't you? Check out campaignforchildren.org/ambassadors on how to become a First Focus on Children ambassador and to link up with our fabulous community of committed child advocates.
First Focus on Children is a bipartisan advocacy organization dedicated to making children and families the priority in federal policy and budget decisions.
First Focus moves beyond individual issues to serve a more important role, child advocacy. We educate lawmakers and the American public about the issues facing children.
To learn more about our work and ways that you can become an ambassador, go to firstfocus.org.
Coming up on the State of Play, Bruce and I get into the relationship between federal and state policy for child advocates.
And when one can complement the other. I think that one of the frustrating things I think we also share is that as child advocates, the public's with us, right? The public supports kids, but our policymakers often ignore or, they're invisible to policymakers.
Right.
So what do you think are the major barriers that kids face with getting policymakers to do right by kids?
Yeah.
And is it a lack of knowledge? Is it political power? what's missing and what needs to happen to fix that?
Well, I would offer these as observations. I certainly don't want to act like my perspective is the answer because I'm sure it's not. And it may vary from state to state and region to region, though I think these are somewhat universal. I think the most troubling trend I see is the nationalization of state policy. So, what we know is that third party dark money groups are developing policies and then they're flat out mandating, selling, or buying support from state to state to state. We have had 3 or 4 years in a row an attack on public benefits. If you go to the Center for Government Accountability and look at their website, you see proposed legislation. Now, what our legislators tell us is they thunk it up on their own. The fact that identical legislation was filed in 24 states last year, you have to either believe in spontaneous legislative combustion. You believe that legislators in Mississippi, Missouri, Michigan, Montana, and Kentucky all came up with the same idea at the same time, my goodness, or you think their strings are getting pulled. I'm just telling you, I'm voting for the second option. And we see that with all kinds of issues. We know those third party groups have big money behind them. They're active political action committee players. So, first of all, Kentucky laws or Texas laws or Utah laws are not being made by Kentucky lawmakers or Texas lawmakers or Utah lawmakers. That are being made by, these distant groups that have undue influence. The second thing that I see happening, and again, I've heard about this in more states than Kentucky, but it's certainly happening in Kentucky. I think, Bruce, I'm accurate that states, whether they're red or blue, are tending towards supermajorities. So in Kentucky, we're red, so it's supermajority Republican. There are states that are tending toward supermajority Democratic. And what I've seen is that means that those caucuses, I've never known if more than one caucus is a caucus or caucuses, but as those caucuses meet, I feel like leadership is carrying around a picture of Kevin McCarthy. And they're afraid that they're going to get Kevin McCarthyized and lose their position. Because we know that as caucuses become larger, they become more diverse, more political demands, more disagreement. And so there was a time that we could count on really strong chamber leadership to kill the really crazy ideas. They may not do everything we wanted, but there was an undergirding that we could count on. I think that's gone. The other thing that I think nationally and probably related to that nationalization is what I see is value schizophrenia. And that is that you used to be able to count on, in Kentucky's case, you knew that the Republican supermajority were going to stand for 3 or 4 core principles. Now, we could agree or disagree. Fiscal responsibility. The one that I would bring up in Kentucky is the answer to almost everything was local control. What do we want for schools? Local control. What do we want for tax policy? Local control. Well, we're now at a place where they are for local control unless they're not for local control. And so you'll watch folks argue to take fluoride out of our water because that's really a local control issue. But when it comes to a huge issue like school safety, we're going to mandate that an urban school protect kids in the same way that a small rural school will. So that nationalization of policy, the fear of getting Kevin McCarthy'd, and that value schizophrenia, I think are the 3 big barriers that we spend a lot of time talking about when it comes to Kentucky. And I have a feeling that's not unique to the Commonwealth.
No, absolutely. And it's one of those things, right? Like for years and years, we all talked about You can be partisan on a whole array of issues, but there should be bipartisan support on kids. And for a while that was the case, I feel, and that's slipping away, I think, for the very reasons you're talking about.
Well, a lot of those national groups, you got to look at why they're funded, and they're funded for an ideological stance on a particular policy issue. So, they can't let data or research confuse their opinion. They can't negotiate because I have this sense they have a scorecard, which is how many states did you get this filed in and how many states did it pass? And that's how they keep the lights on. So it's a very different dynamic than even if you were sitting across the table with somebody disagreeing.
Yeah. I mean, in light of this and just the environment that we're in right now, I mean, how can we work together to address some of these barriers and challenges? Do you see areas that you think the child advocacy community should focus on making progress?
I would love to see two or three things available. And I'm being selfish because I'm thinking about what resources and supports could I use? What resources and supports could my colleagues here at KYA benefit from? One is, I think that we just have to be honest and be more intentional about groupings based on geography or political cohorts. I mean, some folks like to talk about this and some folks run from it, but child advocacy in certain states are very, very different than in other states. And instead of ignoring it, we need to just own it, embrace it, and take advantage of it. It does me a lot of value to know what's happening in Arkansas and Tennessee and Indiana and Ohio. This is no offense to my friends in Oregon or Wisconsin or Massachusetts. I really don't care what you're doing because it's irrelevant to me. And so there is a tendency in national groups that they want to keep everybody clumped. That's a formal phrase. We want to keep everybody clumped together. And I think we just got to own what states, and it's not just geography, but what states have certain political orientations. And I think it would be really beneficial to be able to talk among ourselves. I think another thing is that an area that I think we lack in authentic collegial support is like-minded policy challenges. So my bet is that if the KYA in those other 49 states were to write down the 5 issues that they're worried about in 2025, I bet there's some parallels. There doesn't seem to be a good vehicle to put folks together. So without being redundant, I mentioned regressive juvenile justice policy. We are flat out going to be confronting that in Kentucky come January. I know that. Well, I'd love to be in a learning group, a strategy group with the 10 other states that are confronting that. What are you hearing? What's your answer? Do you have research that we can Kentuckyize? Or do we have research you could use? So some is political ideology. Some is grouping by policy. I also think there's 2 other things very quickly. One is that nationally we've seen money for data and research work begin to dry up. We're getting less and less. We find that so valuable, that local granular data. Wow, that is so powerful. You talk about that first issue around childhood poverty. Our shot to move that in Kentucky has been when we localize that, when we can really drill down and talk to that state senator or representative about childhood poverty, not nationally, not statewide, in your district. And we find that money very, very hard to get and very, very scarce. I wish there was more of that. The final thing I wish we could do as advocates is almost institute a fire alarm system where we kept track of policies that were getting filed or policies we thought were getting filed and get ahead of the curve. It seems like every year there's a regrettable policy idea that pops up that catches us by surprise. I mean, I shouldn't admit that, but it does. And then I find out the same thing went on somewhere else last year or is going on this year. So there has to be a way as advocates that we could give folks a heads up. If it's happening in Kentucky today, Arkansas, you better watch out tomorrow. Yeah. Or if it's happening in, where Michigan today, Ohio, you better watch out tomorrow. So I think they're not fancy. And you notice I have not suggested that anybody form a book club on leadership. Not that I'm against that, but that's not what we need. I'm looking at much more granular, tactical work groups that we can simply help lift each other up.
I love that. It doesn't have to be overcomplicated, right? It's like, let's just get together and get after it.
Yeah, I mean, just somebody putting out an email that says, are kids getting screwed in juvenile justice in your state? Sign up and we'll have a conversation. That's about as basic as you can get, but I think that would be really, really helpful.
It's really interesting because I was asked the other day, do I feel like we're making progress? And I think it's really a crossroads. I feel like in some areas we are making progress. And, you think about early childhood, right? I think that people are understanding the whole concept of brain development and all those kinds of things. But just as you've pointed out so well, there's been funding that's attached to some of these culture wars. And meanwhile, what's being lost is, the basic needs of kids, right?
Yeah.
How do we get out of this rut and make progress for our kids?
Bruce, I thought your phrase was so prescient that we are at a crossroads. First Focus has always been so articulate in reminding us that best policy is common ground, common sense, common good. So it doesn't have to be partisan. But we're at a crossroads. And since you and I are sports guys, what I would tell you is the over-under is that we're going to get rolled if bifurcation, polarization, and toxicity continues to increase. So we just got to get a grip that if we're at the crossroads, we better take the right road, or we're going to look back in 3 or 4 years and wonder how we lost so much so quickly. So what do we do about that? I in no way want to suggest that here is the answer. But if you were to say, what are 2 or 3 cerebral itches? What's on the front of your brain? There's a couple that come to mind. One, and I wish I could give a better citation. I think this was a study that came out of Michigan State maybe 10 years ago, but they had done a typology analysis of policy that I still am fascinated by. We try to pay attention to it at KYA, and they had looked at policies as either dying, established, emerging, or boundary. Part of what I think is happening is attention is being focused on dying and established policy arenas, little attention to emerging, and almost none on boundary issues. We're crafting our 2025 legislative agenda yay verily today. I was so excited because a couple boundary ideas came up. So I think as advocates, when we think about economic well-being or early childhood or child welfare, or whatever the arena folks are in, is to challenge ourselves how much of our effort is around dying policies, established policies, emerging policies, and boundary policies. And I get that. Isn't it ironic that it's easier to get funding around dying policies than boundary policies? But that's really the case. So I think we have to really pay attention to the typology that we're working on. Secondly, as you probably know, and again, you guys are the exception to this because you do such a wonderful job, I really think that a lot of our advocacy efforts lack sophistication and effectiveness in messaging. We pay a lot of attention to Heath and Heath, that whole made to stick kind of effort. What I take away from that is that we have to be very intentional about messaging to the head and the heart, to the intellect and to the emotion. We got to pay attention to those modalities. And I think sometimes we tend to think that lawmaker we're getting ready to talk with has just finished reading our latest policy brief. They probably haven't. They probably heard a story at church or across the backyard fence or at their kids' little league game, and suddenly that's the basis of where they're headed on policy. Well, we're not going to curb that. We're not going to stop that. We should take advantage of it. And so I think we have to do a much more strategic, almost a bimodal kind of messaging than we typically do. Finally, one of our, Bruce, you kind of know this, we at KYA have key strategic imperatives. One of those is win, baby, win. And we like to win.
Yeah.
One of the things that if you were to say wave a magic wand, man, I would love, and I'm not smart enough to figure out how to do this, but wouldn't it be amazing if somebody could get 50 states, the key advocates in all 50 states, to decide on an issue, not 5 issues, not 3 issues, one theme. Cotter, in his book about change, talks about the power of early wins building momentum. I mean, can you imagine if we all said this year, we're all going to work on X? Doesn't mean that's all we're doing. Doesn't mean, everybody may not get their first choice, but we're going to work on one thing across the nation. And A, see who won. B, see how far those other folks got. C, share lessons learned. And D, reboot and go at it again. Because I think unless and until folks see child advocacy as a cohesive and united effort, they're going to pick us off over here on this issue, over there on that issue. So again, without being redundant, paying attention to that policy typology, because I don't think folks think about that very much, getting a lot better at messaging than we frequently are. And then finally, could we actually work together to get a result, from Florida to Oregon and from Arizona to Maine? I think that would create the most amazing momentum that America's kids have seen in a long time.
No, I love that. And, making progress, even incrementally, that's progress.
Yeah. Good is not the enemy of perfect.
Right.
Well, we've come to our last question, which I know you're going to have a good answer for this. And you've been at this for a long time. And some days it can just feel overwhelming. Is there a song, an album that you turn to when you're just like, I'm done?
Well, I've got 2, and I'm going to give you a break and not sing them, but I'll share them. One is the 2008 Billy Currington hit, "God is great, beer is good, and people are crazy." So, the only thing I'd change is to say that God is great, bourbon is good, and many elected people are crazy. So it does stand as a reminder, going back to that messaging, that a data-based brief may not be the best communication for that third category in that song. And it is a reminder of who the audience is.
Yep.
The other song, it's the 2012 song from Jason Aldean, and it's "Flyover States." And the verse on that goes, a couple of guys in first class on a flight from New York to LA. They're kind of making small talk, killing time, 30,000 feet above, just a bunch of cornfields and wheat farms. Man, it all looks the same. Miles and miles of back roads and highways connecting little towns with funny names. I mean, who'd want to live down there in the middle of nowhere? Well, that goes back to my original hypothesis that I worry a lot that there are parts of the nation that national technical assistant folks see as flyover states. Because when I'm thinking about who we're working with in Kentucky, almost every legislator is living on one of those back roads or highways close to a town with a funny name. And that Jason Aldean song really does embolden me, especially after I come back from a national conference, reminding me that maybe what I heard doesn't have the context of Kentucky at its forefront. So it's just a reminder to me that what's the famous phrase, all politics are local,
Yep.
all policy is local. It really reminds me of the kids we're representing, because the kids we represent are in a flyover state, and we have an ethical obligation and an ethical opportunity to deliver for them.
Yeah, 100%.
I think you just gave us an album title.
Absolutely. Well, Terry, thank you so much for joining us today. And what I would say is we need more people like Terry Brooks. We really appreciate all the work you do in Kentucky, but also nationally. And thank you for your dedication to kids.
Well, we appreciate all of you guys at First Focus on Children, and I'm humbled and really honored to be part of this, Bruce. So thanks so much, and thanks for you as well, Sally.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Terry. Well, Bruce, that was such a great conversation. This was one of my first times talking to Terry, and I was just blown away by his insight. And the thing that really struck me was the nuances that, really come out to play when you're talking about policy as it relates to state level policy and federal policy. We started the conversation referencing Annie Casey Foundation's Kids Count report, and Kentucky ranks 38. So that means that there's quite a few states that are worse off. And when you look at things like this and look at rankings, how do you feel federal policy really comes into play or complements state and even local level policy?
I think that our system of federalism is really important, and as child advocates, we need to be really aware. In some states, like New Hampshire and Massachusetts are the top two ranked states, right? You can actually move things, particularly in Massachusetts, in a positive way for kids fairly easily, and so they may have much more robust services and care, and that's a good thing. Like, it's good that child advocates in that state can get things, and Terry's doing as best as he can, and he's done has some remarkable achievements for a state like Kentucky, but he has to play a lot of defense. And the problem really presents is that for the states at the bottom, like states like I just did a blog about Louisiana and Mississippi and how they deserve better than a race to the bottom. And unfortunately, for those two states, their governors are not supportive and actually detrimental to kids. And it's in that respect that federal advocacy is so critical, because what the federal government does is provide a baseline of support for a lot of things. And we care as much about the kids in Mississippi as we do the kids in Oregon. And we want them to be successful too. And so if not for the federal government, there would be almost nothing in the way of early childhood and childcare for the kids in Mississippi. So it really is critical in a lot of ways that you pair state activities with federal.
Yeah, in my view and my experiences, the innovation as it relates to programming really does come from the local and state level, that we then partner with a lot of organizations and a lot of state groups from across the country. We've been doing it, going on 15 years now. That really does help shape tweaks, modifications, enhancements at the federal level to key programs. But to your point around the lack of child advocates in certain states, especially across the South, really does require a federal response.
Yeah, absolutely. And so often this, like, as you said, the state innovation is really critical. Like, a bunch of states had expanded coverage to children in healthcare in the 90s. And based upon those successes, the federal government then said, you know what? All kids deserve that. And so we passed the Children's Health Insurance Program, and it was totally based on the work of states. In fact, it initially was called the State Children's Health Insurance Program. And so that program, is now providing healthcare to 8 million kids across the country. So, and it really did start off as a state level service, but now all children across the country have a baseline set of care that is critical. I mean, CHIP has successfully cut the uninsured rate in this country by 2/3. It was 15% in the nation when it started, and now it's around 5%. So it really has been fundamental, and it did start with states.
I always think of scaling, and some of the conversations that I've had with people that are really, frustrated with federal policy and politics. And I think the constant reminder that I have to remind myself is when you get a win, it's a big win, and the impact is so significant. And it really does help shape and help understand how and why we need to work together, right? Like there's a role in the ecosystem for all players to come together. But again, like the impact and the scale that federal policy can help shape is just so important.
Yeah. And for people like Terry, it's really critical that, they're making some progress, but, I think what's under realized is the role that child advocates play in preventing bad things from happening is also really important. And so, Terry's fighting off some negative, they've been in the vanguard and a leader on, as he talked about, on juvenile justice. And now there's forces that are trying to really take steps backward. And, it's critical that groups like his are protecting kids at this point in time. So defense matters too.
Absolutely. And again, that helps shape what bubbles up at the federal level. Like, what do we need to be aware of? And that's why I love, the nature of the work Terry leads, is because it is cross-sector. So he really does have insights into the nuances of all these areas that really help shape a kid's life in total.
Yeah. And sort of just to preview kind of our next series of podcasts, I think, is Terry's a remarkable educator and very knowledgeable about those things, and has been a leader on early childhood issues as well. And what you're going to hear more from us in the next coming days is what about early childhood and what kinds of things should we be doing in that space. And what we're seeing is we're starting to make progress there, but we're also going to talk about how we're preparing a report on the babies in the budget and just how little we're investing in them and how wrong that is.
It's always shocking to me, especially when, we're just talking about two issues kind of ranging on different ends of the spectrum for kids, on one side, early childhood investments, and on the other side, juvenile justice and youth justice and what that means. And we know the more dollars that are spent in those early years, it's all prevention, right? And then it helps derail a lot of the frustrations and situations that kids get into the older they get.
Yeah, absolutely. This is Speaking of Kids. Thanks for listening. I'm Bruce Lesley.
And I'm Messellech Looby. Special thanks to our guest, Dr. Terry Brooks.
Speaking of Kids is a podcast by First Focus on Children.
Elizabeth Wyndham is the supervising producer, and Julia Wyndham is the associate producer.
Layla Nimatala is the advocacy and mobilization producer, and the senior producer is Jay Woodward.
Our theme music is Don't Look Twice by Sam Barsh.
For more information about this week's episode, go to firstfocus.org. You can find all of our links in our show notes.
If you have any thoughts, questions, or interests in becoming a First Focus on Children ambassador, email us at speakingofkids@firstfocus.org.
And please, please, please follow, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube.
Speaking of Kids is produced by Windhaven Productions and Blue Jay Atlantic.